He built that house with his bare hands, but now he's shivering in a freezing garage, forced to sleep on a flimsy cot between cardboard boxes, while just 50 feet away the windows of his own home glow warm with laughter from his son's in-laws. Every light in that house mocks him. Every sound reminds him he has been erased from the legacy he created with his late wife. The humiliation burns hotter than the cold biting through his bones, and the betrayal cuts deeper than any winter wind. Stay with me, because what he does next will leave you speechless. Subscribe, and don't miss it. He was 68 years old, and every year weighed heavy on his shoulders as he sat in the damp chill of that garage. The cold concrete floor seemed to seep into his bones, reminding him not of the strength he once carried, but of the frailty time had delivered. He thought of the decades he had poured into that house, the sweat and grit of his younger hands driving nails, lifting beams, sanding wood until it gleamed. Back then he imagined his children would one day walk those halls with pride, cherishing the home as a monument to family. Instead, the laughter inside those walls now belonged to strangers, and he was left on the other side shivering in exile. His life had once been full of purpose. He remembered mornings when he rose before dawn, kissed his wife on the forehead, and left for the construction site while the town was still sleeping. He had built more than houses. He had built a reputation. Families trusted him to create their dreams, and he never failed them. By the time his business reached its height, he had created an empire of brick, wood, and sweat. But all the accolades and contracts meant nothing without the woman who had stood by him. She had been the heart of everything. When cancer took her, it felt as though the foundation of his world cracked down the middle. Now, in the silence of the garage, that grief came back in waves. He stared at the ceiling beams, crude and unfinished, and remembered the polished oak beams of the living room inside beams he had sanded with care while his wife painted the walls her favorite shade of cream. He remembered her laughter when the paint splattered on her dress, the warmth of her voice calling him in for dinner after a long day of work. That house was their love made solid. Every corner, every nail carried her touch. And now every glowing window was a reminder that he had been cut off from her memory as well. He thought about his son Michael, the boy he had once carried on his shoulders, who used to fall asleep in his arms after long summer days. Michael had once begged to help with small projects, holding the hammer too tightly, eager to be just like his father. He had promised himself that one day the house would belong to Michael, not as a prize but as a trust, a place to raise his own children. That dream had died the moment Michael allowed his wife's family to treat the man who built it like an unwanted guest. The bitterness stung, but the loneliness cut deeper. Friends his age often talked about grandchildren dropping by on weekends, about family dinners crowded around old wooden tables. He sat on a cot that squeaked under his weight, his only companion the hum of a space heater that struggled against the cold. The cardboard boxes piled around him were filled with forgotten tools and old photo albums, ghosts of the past stacked carelessly in the dust. He wondered if anyone in that house even remembered that those boxes were his remnants of a life he once lived just a few steps away. At 68, he had expected to slow down, maybe spend his evenings reading on the porch, sipping a glass of whiskey, and watching the sun set over the maple trees he had planted decades ago. Instead, he was listening to the muffled clinking of glasses, the rise and fall of voices, and the bursts of laughter that belonged to people who had done nothing to earn it. They were using his home as a stage for their own pride, while he, the builder, the provider, the father, was hidden away like an inconvenient truth. He thought of the respect he had once commanded. In his prime, people shook his hand firmly, looked him in the eye, and thanked him for the homes he gave them. Even the mayor once praised his work at a ribbon cutting. But here, in the heart of the very legacy he created, he was invisible. His son avoided his gaze. His daughter-in-law barely acknowledged his existence, and the people gathered inside likely didn't even know the man in the garage was the true master of that house. The ache in his chest wasn't just from the cold. It was from knowing he had sacrificed everything for family and had become nothing more than an afterthought. His wife's last wish had been for him to take care of Michael to make sure their son had everything he needed. He had taken that vow seriously, even to the point of signing over the deed to the house. It had seemed noble then, a father's act of love. But sitting in that garage, he wondered if it had been foolishness dressed as devotion. He closed his eyes and tried to picture her face the way she used to smile at him with quiet pride when Michael achieved something, the way her hand would squeeze his under the table as if to say, "We did this together." What would she say if she saw him now, banished to a cot like some beggar while their son dined with people who disrespected everything she held dear? Would she be disappointed in Michael, or in him for letting it happen? The night stretched long, every sound amplified by the isolation. He could hear the faint strains of music from the dining room, the clatter of cutlery, the cadence of voices. He imagined the chandelier casting warm golden light across the table, the same chandelier he had hung himself with aching arms 30 years ago. He pictured the oak dining table polished to a shine, once the center of family meals, now turned into a stage for people who saw him as nothing. In the stillness, the truth became unbearable. He wasn't just cold. He wasn't just tired. He was forgotten. All those years of labor, all those sacrifices meant nothing in the eyes of the very people who should have valued them most. His existence had been reduced to a burden, a problem to be hidden away in a garage. And yet beneath the weight of despair, a spark flickered. Loneliness had hardened into clarity. Loss had stripped away illusions. He could not change what had been taken from him. His wife, his youth, the respect he once commanded, but he could decide what came next. He could choose whether to fade quietly into the background or to remind everyone, especially his son, exactly who he was. The cold no longer numbed him. It sharpened him. The silence was no longer empty. It was filled with resolve. They thought they had pushed him aside, erased him from the story of the house he built. But they were wrong. This was not the end of his story. This was the beginning of something else entirely. And when that beginning unfolded, it would shake every corner of that house, and every person inside it would learn what happens when a father who has given everything is treated as nothing. Stay with me, because what he does next will not just change his life, it will turn theirs upside down. The lights from the house cut through the dark like an insult. Each glowing window was a reminder that life carried on without him, that the laughter and clinking glasses inside were no longer meant for his ears. He sat hunched on the edge of the cot, coat pulled tight, listening to the muffled sounds of conversation carried by the cold wind. The voices were rich with cheer, with pride, with a comfort that mocked the silence of his exile. It wasn't just the exclusion that stung. It was the deliberate ease with which they erased him, as if the man who had poured his life into building that home had never existed at all. He tried to ignore it, but the echoes seeped in anyway. The rising pitch of a toast, the peal of laughter from his son's wife's father, the cadence of a story being told. They laughed over wine poured into glasses he had once bought with his wife, the same crystal she had chosen with care when they still walked through stores together planning a future. Those glasses should have been clinking to celebrate anniversaries, holidays, grandchildren's milestones. Instead, they were held in hands that had done nothing to earn them. The garage smelled of oil and dust, the scent of neglect. He could feel the grit under his palms when he braced himself against the wall, every particle a reminder of where he had been cast aside. Inside, he imagined the scent of roasted meat butter melting into bread wine breathing in fine decanters. He knew that smell well. He had worked long hours to provide it. Yet now he was left with the sour tang of gasoline and rust, while others feasted. The contrast burned deeper than the cold. He remembered the night his son first invited him to one of those dinners. It had been years ago, before the shift had become permanent. He sat at the head of the table that evening, though he noticed how his son's wife and her family leaned toward each other, conversations flowing around him but rarely to him. He had convinced himself it was his imagination, that the distance was temporary. But over time the invitations grew fewer, the glances more strained, until finally they stopped asking altogether. What remained was silence, a silence punctuated only by the sound of joy he could not share. The humiliation wasn't only in being excluded. It was in knowing the people inside had convinced themselves it was justified. They would say he was too old, too quiet, too out of touch. They would call it awkward claim. His presence disrupted the polished image they wanted to project. His son's father-in-law was a banker who liked to brag about deals made over golf. His son's mother-in-law boasted of designer kitchens and country club galas. To them, he was an inconvenience, a shadow that spoiled the sheen of their perfect circle. And his son, his own blood, had chosen to agree. He stared at the frost collecting on the small window of the garage, the crystals forming patterns that looked almost beautiful in the moonlight. But beauty meant nothing when it reminded him that warmth was close enough to touch, yet forever out of reach. The distance wasn't measured in feet, but in dignity. Every light from the house told him he was no longer part of their story, no longer invited into the narrative he had built with his own hands. The bitterness pressed down hard, but beneath it lived something sharper, something alive. Humiliation, he realized, was more than pain, it was a teacher. It carved truth into his chest with every passing night. It showed him where he stood in their eyes. And more importantly, it showed him what they had forgotten. They thought of him as powerless, a relic shoved into the shadows. They didn't know the strength still hidden beneath the years, the knowledge still locked inside his mind, the means he had carefully preserved. He ran his hand over the photograph tucked into the pocket of his coat, a worn picture of his wife smiling on the porch of that very house. She had believed in him when no one else did. She had trusted him with her dreams, her love, her future. He had delivered on all of it. He thought of what she would say now, seeing him reduced to a guest in his own home, pushed aside, while strangers enjoyed what was hers as much as his. She would not have been silent. She would have reminded him who he was. The laughter inside reached another peak, followed by applause. He could picture the scene, his son raising a glass, his in-laws smiling with approval, everyone basking in the glow of a home that had cost him years of labor. His son's voice, so full of charm, carried easily through the glass panes. It was the same voice that once called him Dad with reverence, the same voice that once promised to make him proud. Now it was the voice of betrayal, a voice that no longer carried respect. He pressed his palms into his knees, feeling the veins bulge with tension. The humiliation had cut deep, but it had also sharpened something that had dulled in him since his wife's death. He was tired of being silent, tired of being erased, tired of being told his place was outside. They wanted him invisible, but invisibility was not in his nature. He had built homes, businesses, legacies. He had weathered storms harsher than exclusion, faced losses greater than cold nights in a garage. And each time he had risen. The clock on the wall ticked slowly, its sound louder than it should have been in the quiet space. Every second was a reminder of time slipping by, time he could not reclaim. But time could be used. He would use it to plan to sharpen his next move, to turn their arrogance against them. They thought the humiliation would weaken him, would push him into submission. But it had done the opposite. It had awakened him. Through the thin wall, he could hear a new round of conversation, starting the scrape of chairs, the clink of plates. His son's voice again, full of ease, speaking as though nothing in the world could touch him. That was the mistake. His son had forgotten who had given him that ease, who had sacrificed to make sure he could stand so confidently in that room. He had forgotten the man in the garage was the same man who had built everything he now claimed as his own. The humiliation no longer burned. It steadied him. It clarified the divide, drew the line clean between who they thought he was and who he truly remained. They had underestimated him, dismissed him, erased him. But the story wasn't over, not by a long stretch. He would remind them that the foundation of that house, the life they flaunted, was his creation. And when he chose to move, when he chose to act, the ground beneath their feet would shift. Stay with me, because the moment he steps out of that garage, nothing in that house will ever be the same again. He could still feel the weight of the beams on his shoulders, the sting in his palms from hauling lumber in the July heat, and the rhythm of his wife's laughter as she handed him cold lemonade from the porch. That house was not just timber and stone. It was their dream carved into reality. He remembered measuring every corner twice, because she teased him about being too precise, and then smiling when she painted the walls anyway in a shade she loved even if it clashed with his sense of symmetry. They had argued over light fixtures, laughed over crooked tiles, and stood arm in arm on the front lawn the day it was finished, both of them sweaty, exhausted, but beaming with pride. It had been a monument to their devotion, a testament to their endurance, a sanctuary meant to outlast both of them. Those memories, once warm, now cut like knives. He looked toward the windows glowing in the night and saw not light but betrayal. Each room he had built with care was filled with voices that did not belong, faces that had never lifted a hammer or tightened a bolt, people who saw the house only as a backdrop for their vanity. The staircase he and his wife had polished together step by step was now nothing more than a path for his son's in-laws to climb as they carried glasses of champagne. The kitchen, where his wife had stirred pots of soup on long winter nights, was now a stage for catered meals prepared to impress guests who barely knew the history of the place. He remembered the first Christmas in that house. His wife had insisted on stringing garlands along the banister, and he had teased her for overdoing it. Their son, still a boy, had sat cross-legged by the tree, his eyes wide as he opened gifts they had saved months to buy. That night had smelled of pine and cinnamon, and the laughter had been genuine, rising to the rafters like music. Now at Christmas, he had not even been invited to the table. The same banister once covered in garlands was polished to a shine for guests who would never know the joy it once held. He remembered the nights they spent on the porch, her head leaning on his shoulder as the cicadas sang. She had told him then that the house felt alive, as if every wall remembered their touch. He had believed her. He still did. And he wondered what those walls thought now, hearing laughter that carried no love, only arrogance. He wondered if the house itself mourned her absence, if it recognized that it had been taken from the hands that built it and given to people who did not care for its soul. Every corner of that house bore her fingerprints. The hidden reading nook she had begged him to build beneath the stairs where their son once curled up with picture books. The oak cabinets she insisted he carve by hand because store-bought would never carry the same weight of memory. The dining table, scarred with marks from family dinners, now covered with pristine cloths to hide its imperfections. What they saw as flaws had been their history etched into the wood by years of living. To strangers, those marks meant nothing. To him, they were sacred. The more he remembered, the sharper the loss became. That house had been their fortress against the world. When work was lean, when money was tight, when storms battered the roof, they had always faced it together. He remembered patching leaks in the rain while she held the flashlight steady, laughing when the water splashed into her boots. He remembered her smile as he carried her across the threshold. The promise they had whispered in that very doorway. Whatever happened, they would never let the house fall into ruin. It was more than a promise about wood and brick. It was a vow about their life together. Now the ruin was not in the walls, but in the meaning. The foundation had not cracked, but the family had. The betrayal from his own son had turned sanctuary into prison, devotion into humiliation. Every memory of her warmth was now twisted by the chill of the garage. Every laugh they once shared drowned out by the shallow laughter of people who had no part in their sacrifice. He rubbed his calloused hands together, staring at the faint outline of the home in the night. Those hands had built it, sustained it, defended it. He remembered his wife pressing her palms against his and telling him she loved the roughness, loved the story in every scar. They were not just hands of a builder. They were the hands that had held her through sickness, that had caught their son when he stumbled, that had built a future with nothing but determination. And now, those same hands were expected to stay folded in silence, as if they had no claim to the life they had created. The nostalgia brought not only sorrow, but a dangerous kind of clarity. If that house was once a symbol of devotion, then the betrayal unfolding within it was the highest insult. It wasn't just about where he slept or what space he was given. It was about the erasure of love, the rewriting of history, the theft of something sacred. They could remodel rooms, replace cabinets, strip away every visible trace of her, but they could never erase the truth of who had built it and why. He leaned back against the cold wall of the garage, letting the memories swirl like ghosts around him. She was still there in every detail, in every shadow. Her absence hurt, but her presence in the memory gave him strength. If the house had been their greatest creation, then perhaps it was also his greatest weapon. Those inside thought they had stripped him of power, but they didn't understand that memory itself could be sharper than any blade. The night pressed in closer, and the voices inside rose higher. He closed his eyes, and for a moment he was back in the warmth of the living room, her hand on his, the fire crackling in the hearth, his son playing with toy cars on the rug. Then the vision shattered, replaced by reality, the muffled bragging of his son's in-laws, the clinking of wine glasses that were not raised in his honor. The contrast burned like fire in his chest. It was then in that quiet fury that he realized nostalgia was no longer a refuge. It was fuel. Every memory of devotion was now a reason for resolve, every flash of love a weapon against betrayal. They thought they had taken the house from him. They thought they had reduced him to silence. But they had forgotten one thing. A man who built his life from nothing never forgets how to rebuild even from ashes. Stay with me, because the memories that once kept him alive are about to become the fire that burns everything they thought they owned. Michael's voice still echoed in his ears, slick with that careful warmth that had once fooled him. "Dad, it'll make life easier," his son had said, sliding the paperwork across the table with that practiced smile, the one that made him think of his wife's dying wish. He remembered the way the pen had felt in his hand that day, heavy as lead, shaking slightly as he signed away not just the deed, but a piece of himself. He had told himself it was for Michael's future, that it was what she would have wanted, that giving him the house early was a gesture of love. But sitting in the garage now, the laughter of strangers rattling the windows, he knew the truth. His son hadn't asked out of need. He had asked out of greed. It was all there in hindsight, every subtle nudge, every well-timed word. Michael had leaned on his grief like a crutch, pressing the memory of his wife into every sentence, until resistance felt like betrayal. "Mom always said you'd make sure I was taken care of," he had whispered, eyes glistening with just enough moisture to look convincing. At the time, the words pierced him, softened him, made him believe he was fulfilling a sacred promise. Now he realized they had been sharpened tools wielded not by a son seeking guidance, but by a man who saw opportunity in sorrow. He thought back to the night after signing the papers. He had sat alone in the living room, the documents locked away in Michael's briefcase, staring at the walls he had built. His chest had been heavy, not just with grief, but with unease. He had told himself it was doubt, the natural ache of letting go. But deep down, he had known. He had felt it in the pit of his stomach, the wrongness of it, the sense that he had just traded love for obligation. And now that instinct roared back with venom. The manipulation had not ended with the deed. It had crept into every corner of his life afterward. Michael's wife, with her careful smiles, her subtle suggestions about giving the young couple space. Michael's in-laws always circling like hawks, their eyes assessing the house with hunger. Every polite conversation had been a test, every favor a transaction. And he had played along, believing it was his role as father, believing he was still part of the family. He had mistaken exploitation for inclusion, thinking that his presence, however diminished, still mattered. But the reality was clear now. The garage wasn't just a slight, it was the inevitable conclusion of a strategy. Remove him from the house, reduce him to dependence, and eventually erase him altogether. His son's charm had been a mask, and behind it lived calculation. Michael had inherited nothing of his mother's compassion, only her ability to persuade, but twisted into something cruel. Bitterness surged, filling the cracks where grief had once been. He thought of every sacrifice, every late payment he had covered for Michael when he was young and reckless, every loan forgiven, every chance given. He remembered nights when his wife had begged him to be patient, to believe their son would grow mature, change. She had believed in Michael until her last breath. He had promised to do the same. and now that promise shackled him to humiliation. The papers had not just stripped him of ownership, they had stripped him of authority. Each renovation Michael ordered, each guest invited into the house, each decision made without so much as a glance in his direction, it was all possible because of that single moment of weakness. He had placed the future in his son's hands, and his son had used it to push him aside. The betrayal was not in one act, but in the steady erosion of trust masked in words like, easier, helpful family. He stared at the dim bulb swinging above his cot, listening to the muffled cheers from the dining room, and realized he had been played. The charm had been nothing but bait. His grief had been the trap, and he had walked straight into it. Yet with the bitterness came something sharper, colder, more dangerous. Clarity. He saw the lines of manipulation now, the threads Michael had pulled, the way he had been maneuvered like a pawn in his own home. He could trace the steps, map the moves, and now that he saw them, he could unravel them. The same instincts that had built a business from nothing, the same foresight that had turned sweat into security, had not abandoned him. They had only been dulled by grief. Now they were awake again, honed by anger. He thought of his wife's words, her plea that he always protect their son. He had taken them literally, too literally, twisting devotion into surrender. But maybe he had misunderstood. Maybe protecting their son wasn't about shielding him from consequences. Maybe it was about making sure he never destroyed himself or others with his own choices. And right now, Michael was burning bridges with gasoline, and the fire would not stop at the father in the garage. It would consume his wife, his marriage, even the legacy of the house itself. The manipulation was clear now, but clarity came with responsibility. He could not undo the signature on the deed, but he could decide what came next. He could stay silent, keep sleeping in the cold, keep letting them rewrite the story of his life until nothing remained. Or he could step back into the role they had forgotten he once held, the builder, the leader, the man who created everything they now enjoyed. Bitterness gave way to resolve. They thought the manipulation was complete, that the pawn had been cornered. But they had forgotten who had built the board in the first place. Stay with me, because the moment he decides to stop being their pawn is the moment this entire game explodes. He stood in the doorway once, watching strangers tear down what his own hands had built. The cabinets carved from solid oak, with his late wife's voice guiding every detail, were pried from the walls and tossed aside like junk. Sawdust clouded the air, and the sound of drills pierced through the silence that had once been filled with laughter and music. The reading nook beneath the stairs, the small sanctuary where his boy once fell asleep with comic books sprawled across his lap, was smashed apart, replaced with cold stone and sterile finishes that looked like they belonged in a hotel lobby. He had not been asked. He had not even been told. By the time he returned from an errand, it was already gone. Every detail that carried his wife's fingerprints was stripped away in the name of progress. The tiles she painted by hand in the guest bathroom, each brushstroke chosen with love, were shattered into rubble and replaced with slabs of marble that glared under artificial light. The curtains she had sewn late into the night, humming as she worked, were ripped down and tossed into bags. The carved table his wife insisted they commission for their 25th anniversary, once the heart of every family meal, had been shoved into storage to make room for something sleeker. With each change he felt her slipping further away, as though her very memory was being scrubbed out of existence. He would stand quietly on the edges, forced to nod, while contractors marched in and out, carrying away the past like trash. His son's wife would smile, explaining that clients expected a certain image, that appearances mattered, that the old touches made the house look dated. His son said little, just looked at him with that distant expression, the kind that told him he had already lost the argument before it began. And so he said nothing, swallowing the anger that pressed against his ribs, watching helplessly as the legacy he had built with blood and devotion was consumed by a vision that was not his own. The worst part was how quickly it happened. A home that had taken decades to build, to shape, to live in, was dismantled in weeks. The warmth of oak and hand-carved detail gave way to steel and glass. The intimacy of corners and nooks was replaced by open spaces designed for spectacle, not family. It was not just a renovation, it was an erasure. The house was no longer a sanctuary, it was a showroom, and he was no longer welcome to stand at its center. He walked through the hall one evening, his footsteps muffled on the new floors, and for the first time he felt like a stranger in his own home. The walls, once alive with pictures of birthdays and anniversaries, now stood bare, waiting for abstract art chosen by someone who had never shared a meal at that table. He brushed his fingers along the cold surfaces and found nothing familiar. It was as if the house itself had turned its back on him, bowing instead to the new order imposed by his son's ambition and his daughter-in-law's pride. His dignity cracked with each change. He had once been the master of this home, the man who made every decision about its bones and its soul. Now he was reduced to silence, a shadow in the corner, treated like an old relic that clashed with the decor. He could feel the weight of invisibility pressing down harder than the cold garage air. The house had become a mirror of his position in the family, stripped of meaning, remade without his consent, a hollow version of what it once was. At night he lay awake on his cot, remembering the way his wife used to move through those rooms. She had loved the imperfections, the quirks that made the house theirs. The chipped stair rail she refused to let him fix because she said it held stories. The uneven patch of paint in the hallway where their son had tried to help and left a smudge that made her laugh every time she passed. Those flaws had been the life of the house, the details that made it human. Now they were gone, painted over, sanded down, eradicated in pursuit of something soulless. And yet he saw the pattern clearly. This wasn't just about style or taste. It was about control. Every cabinet removed, every wall repainted, was another reminder that he no longer held authority. His son and his wife weren't simply remodeling the house, they were remodeling the story, pushing him further out with every decision. What had once been his legacy was now their stage, and he had been recast as a background figure, barely visible, tolerated only when convenient. He thought about the day the contractors ripped out the nook under the stairs. He had argued then, his voice breaking as he told them his wife had designed it herself, that his boy had spent hours there. The foreman had looked uncomfortable, but the order had come from his son's wife, and the work continued. He had stood there powerless, as the wood splintered, the sound of hammers drowning out his protests. When it was over, he found himself staring at an empty space that no longer held memory, just drywall. He had never felt so small. That night, sitting alone in the garage, he realized that the house had become a battlefield and he was losing every inch without lifting a hand. They had turned his devotion into weakness, his silence into permission. His wife's memory was being buried under polished surfaces, and with it his own dignity. The helplessness gnawed at him, sharper than hunger, colder than the draft seeping through the garage walls. But powerlessness, he realized, was an illusion. He might have lost the deed. He might have lost his place at the table. But what he still had was knowledge, memory, and something far more dangerous, resolve. They thought he was broken, beaten, irrelevant. They thought stripping the house of its past meant stripping him of his strength. They were wrong. Because beneath the bitterness and the silence, something new was taking shape. Every loss carved him sharper, every erasure made him harder, every insult set his jaw tighter. He was not just watching his legacy slip away. He was watching it be stolen. And a man who built something from nothing knows better than anyone how to take it back. Stay with me, because the moment he stops watching and starts acting will turn their polished dream into a nightmare they never saw coming. He remembered Samuel's voice as clearly as if the man were standing in the garage with him, leaning against the wall with that unshakable calm he always carried. Never give up total control. Samuel had warned, eyes narrowing over the rim of his coffee cup. They had been sitting on the porch years ago, the sun dipping low, the smell of fresh-cut grass drifting in the air. Samuel had seen it coming, the way his son's wife lingered on every detail about the house, the way Michael's smile grew a little too practiced when he brought up responsibility and future. Samuel had told him plainly, generosity without caution becomes surrender. At the time, he had laughed it off, thinking his old friend was too suspicious, too hardened by his own battles. He had believed that trust was a gift, not a gamble. Now as he sat in the dark, the truth struck with the weight of iron. Samuel had been right. That single stroke of a pen had been less an act of love and more a surrender flag. He had disguised it in his mind as loyalty to his wife's last wish, a father's duty to his son. But the reality was harsher. It had been denial. He had known deep down that Michael's charm was laced with calculation. He had felt the hesitation in his hand before the ink dried. Yet he had silenced it, buried it under the illusion that trust could never be misplaced between father and son. Denial is a dangerous comfort. It lets a man sleep at night while his world is being stripped plank by plank. He had told himself for years that the changes were natural, that a younger generation would bring new ideas, that stepping back was part of the cycle of life. He had mistaken exclusion for progress, disrespect for independence. Every warning sign had been there, the quick decisions made without his input, the sideways glances when he voiced concern, the careful way his daughter-in-law always smiled, as if indulging a child, rather than acknowledging the man who built everything she stood on. Samuel had seen it for what it was. He had chosen not to. The garage smelled faintly of oil and mildew, but beneath it was the stench of regret. Regret for every moment he had ignored Samuel's caution. Regret for every time he had waved away his own instincts, telling himself it was paranoia, that love excused all things. He had been a builder all his life, a man who knew the importance of strong foundations. Yet he had allowed his own family foundation to rot from within. He had let his grief blind him, let nostalgia bind him, until truth arrived too late, too brutal to soften. He could see Samuel's face lined with years of hard-earned wisdom, shaking his head the last time they spoke about the house. "You think you're giving him a gift," Samuel had said, "but you're giving him a weapon. And once he learns how to use it, you won't be able to take it back." At the time, those words had stung. He had called them cynical, even cruel. But now, as laughter spilled from the house into the frozen night, he realized they had been prophetic. The hardest part wasn't that Samuel had been right. It was that he himself had known it somewhere beneath the denial. Every father hopes his son will rise to the occasion, will prove himself worthy of the trust placed in him. He had clung to that hope like a drowning man clutching driftwood, ignoring the water filling his lungs. And now hope was gone. All that remained was the bitter truth: his generosity had not been met with gratitude. It had been met with greed. Denial had kept him quiet while the walls changed color, while the memories were stripped away, while the doors closed on him. Truth now sat beside him in the cold garage, uninvited, but impossible to ignore. It whispered in his ear that silence had cost him everything, that trust without boundaries had delivered him into exile. He could almost hear Samuel again. Not as a caution now, but as a demand. "So what are you going to do about it?" The question lingered in the dark, heavy and insistent. He had no answer yet, but he knew one thing for certain. Denial was no longer an option. He could not unsee the betrayal, could not unhear the laughter that excluded him, could not undo the signature that had given away his power. But he could choose how the next chapter unfolded. And in that choice there was still a sliver of control left to claim. For the first time in months, maybe years, he felt the weight of clarity press harder than the ache of grief. Samuel's warning had not been a condemnation. It had been a gift he had ignored. Now it stood before him again, sharper than ever, demanding action. He thought of the house not just as walls and floors, but as a stage where the truth had been hidden too long. If Samuel had been right about the danger, then perhaps he had also been right about the remedy. A man who builds something never truly loses it. He just has to be willing to fight for it again. The night stretched longer, the voices inside the house fading into murmurs as the hour grew late. He sat still, the cold biting his hands, but inside him something stirred, an ember long buried under ashes of denial. Samuel's voice, the truth he had once rejected, now fed that ember, fanned it into a spark. He was no longer the man who signed away control without question. He was the man who had built everything from nothing, and he still knew how to rebuild. Stay with me, because the moment he stops regretting and starts listening to that ember is the moment the tide begins to turn. The words had landed with the precision of a blade, clean and merciless. You're better off in the garage. His son had said it casually, without venom, without even raising his voice. But that made it worse. Cruelty, dressed in indifference, cut deeper than open malice. The father stood frozen for a moment, as if the air had been knocked out of him. He had expected disrespect, had even grown used to it in small doses, but this was something else. This was finality. This was his own child, carving him out of the family story like a blemish to be erased. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the faint sound of a chair sliding across the polished floors. His daughter-in-law's eyes didn't even flicker toward him. She just adjusted her wine glass, swirling the red liquid lazily, as if the man she was banishing were nothing more than background noise. His son's father-in-law smirked politely, pretending not to hear, but his satisfaction was palpable. In that moment, the father realized this wasn't just about space or convenience. It was about power, and he had just been reminded brutally that he had none left in their eyes. He walked toward the garage in a haze, his knees aching, his chest tight. Each step felt heavier than the last, not from age, but from humiliation pressing down on his spine. The garage door creaked when he pulled it open, its sound sharp and metallic, mocking him, as it revealed the cold space that would now be his prison. He looked back once, just once, at the warm glow of the house, but the door closed quickly behind him. He stood alone in the dark, the smell of oil and dust filling his lungs, and something inside him cracked. Anger surged hot and violent, flooding veins that had carried only grief and resignation for too long. He wanted to shout, to pound his fists against the walls, to storm back inside and remind them whose hands had built every inch of that house. But grief followed close behind, cold and suffocating, pulling him back into silence. The two emotions collided, twisting inside him, tearing at the fragile restraint that had kept him quiet all these months. His wife's memory, his son's betrayal, his friend's warnings, they all converged at once, pressing against the dam of his composure. He sat down on the cot, the springs squealing under his weight, and buried his face in his hands. The image of his wife's smile burned behind his eyelids, a reminder of everything he had lost. She would never have allowed this. She would have stood in that dining room, her voice sharp, her eyes blazing, and silence would have fallen instantly. She had always been the balance, the one who softened Michael's selfish streak, the one who reminded him to listen, to care. Without her, the boy had grown into a man who no longer recognized the value of sacrifice. Without her, the father had lost the only ally who could bridge the widening gulf. Tears welled but did not fall. He was too angry to cry, too humiliated to give sorrow the release it craved. His fists clenched, the veins standing out like blue cords beneath his skin. The sound of laughter drifted in through the walls, muffled but unmistakable. They were celebrating. They were feasting while he sat in exile. He imagined the wine dripping into glasses, the food served on plates, the chairs pulled close together while his absence left a deliberate gap unacknowledged. Each sound drove the knife deeper, twisting it until anger and grief blurred into something harder, colder. He remembered Samuel's words again, the warning he had ignored, and for the first time he felt not just regret, but rage at himself. He had allowed this. He had handed them the keys, given away the deed, silenced his instincts in the name of loyalty. And this was his reward, a cot in a garage, a son who dismissed him like a burden, a family that erased him from the picture. He hated them for it, but in that moment he hated himself more. But anger has a way of burning through self-pity, leaving behind only steel. The longer he sat there, the more his grief hardened into something unyielding. He had spent his life building, not breaking. He had turned bare land into a home, wages, into security, love, into a legacy. He was not a man who simply accepted exile. Not before, not now. The humiliation hurt, yes, but it also sharpened him, carved away the illusions, left only the truth. He had been played, betrayed, discarded. And if they thought that meant he was finished, They had no idea who he truly was. The garage light flickered overhead, casting his shadow against the wall. He studied it for a moment, seeing not an old man, but a survivor. The face was lined, the hair grayer than he remembered, but the eyes still burned with the same fire that had carried him through decades of hard work and sacrifice. They had mistaken his silence for weakness. They had confused his grief for surrender. But grief can ignite and silence can shatter. He rose from the cot slowly, his body stiff but his resolve steady. The air was cold, but inside he was burning. He looked once more at the walls that confined him and realized they would not hold him for long. His son's words still cut deep, but now they fueled something dangerous. Being told he was better off in the garage was not the end of his story. It was the breaking point, the moment humiliation turned into defiance. Stay with me, because when a father reaches the breaking point, the house that cast him out will never stand the same again. Her voice lived inside him, still quiet, but unshakable, as though the words had been carved into his bones the moment she spoke them. He remembered the night clearly, the hospital room thick with the antiseptic smell, the monitor's steady beep cutting through the silence. She had turned her head toward him, eyes dim with exhaustion, yet fierce with love, and whispered, "Always protect Michael. Make sure he has everything he needs." He had taken her hand and nodded, promising through a throat too tight to speak. It was the last vow he made to her, and it had haunted him every day since. Now he sat in the garage, the weight of that promise pressing harder than the cold. He wondered if he had twisted her words, if devotion had become blindness, if love had become submission. Protecting Michael had been her wish, but what had it turned him into? A man stripped of his home, silenced in his own legacy, banished to a cot, while others feasted at his table. Was this what she had wanted when she asked him to look after their son? Or had he betrayed not only himself but also her memory by letting generosity rot into weakness? He thought of her strength. She had been the one who balanced him, who knew when to give and when to stand firm. She had raised Michael with both tenderness and discipline, always quick with affection, but never afraid to draw a line. "He has to learn," she used to say, her tone gentle but immovable. She had believed in teaching responsibility, not indulgence. And yet after she was gone, he had done the opposite. He had shielded Michael from consequence, indulged him at every turn, given him chance after chance. Was that protection, or was it sabotage dressed as love? The more he thought about it, the more the truth dug in. He hadn't been honoring her memory, he had been hiding behind it. Every time Michael asked for money, every time he pushed for more, every time he manipulated him with a smile and a reminder of Mom's wishes, he had told himself he was fulfilling that sacred vow. But maybe he had only been fulfilling his own fear. Fear of failing, her fear of letting go, fear of being alone. Protecting Michael had become an excuse, a way to avoid facing the silence of the house without her. He closed his eyes and pictured her as she had been standing on the porch with her arms folded. Sunlight catching her hair, that steady gaze fixed on him. She wouldn't have wanted this. She wouldn't have wanted him humiliated, erased, made invisible in the very home they had built together. She wouldn't have wanted their son's greed to go unchecked, his arrogance to grow unchecked. Her words had been about love, not surrender. And in twisting them, he had lost not only control of the house, but of himself. The grief mixed with anger again, but now it sharpened into something clearer: resolve. Protecting Michael didn't mean giving him everything he asked for. It didn't mean surrendering his dignity or erasing her memory to appease him. True protection was harder. It meant forcing him to face the truth even if it broke him. It meant showing him that love without boundaries becomes poison. It meant stepping out of the garage, stepping back into the role of father. Not the silent provider, not the humiliated victim, but the man his wife had trusted to hold the family together. He thought of all the times she had looked at him with quiet pride. When he came home, covered in sawdust, exhausted but smiling. When they stood together in the half-finished living room, hands clasped both, knowing the house they had built would outlast them. She had believed in him then, not because he gave her everything she wanted, but because he knew when to fight, when to hold firm. That was the man she had married. That was the man she had trusted with her final words. Somewhere along the way, he had forgotten it. Now he had to remember. The garage felt different suddenly. The shadows didn't just whisper humiliation, they challenged him. Every sound from the house, every laugh, every clink of glasses was no longer just a reminder of betrayal. It was a call to action. He had allowed her memory to be erased, but he would not allow it to be replaced. He had allowed his promise to twist into submission, but he would not allow it to define his end. If she were here, she would tell him to rise. If she were here, she would tell him to fight. The vow still mattered. He would protect Michael, but not in the way his son expected. Protection would no longer mean shielding him from the consequences of his greed. It would mean forcing him to face them. It would mean tearing away the false security that arrogance had built, showing him that the foundation beneath his feet was not his own, but his father's. It would mean reminding him that nothing comes free, that love is not a license for exploitation. It would mean reclaiming the house, the dignity, the memory of the woman who had trusted him with everything. For the first time in years, he felt her presence not as grief but as strength. He could almost hear her voice, not frail in a hospital bed, but strong and certain, telling him what he already knew. Protecting their son did not mean bowing to him. It meant teaching him even if the lesson came too late, even if it shattered the illusion of comfort. The father wiped his hands across his face, and when he looked up, his eyes no longer carried the weight of denial. They carried purpose. Stay with me, because the moment he chooses to honor her promise in truth rather than in fear is the moment everything inside that house begins to collapse. He lay flat on the thin cot, staring up at the exposed beams of the garage ceiling, the air heavy with the bitter scent of dust and oil. The laughter from the house trickled through the walls like poison, faint yet sharp enough to cut through his chest. Each burst of joy reminded him of what he had lost, of how far he had fallen from the place he once held at the center of his own family. His son's voice rose above the others now and then, confident, casual, completely untouched by the thought of the man who had built the roof over his head. The father knew then with a certainty that was colder than the night air that Michael would never defend him. He would never fight for his place, never protect him, never even remember the sacrifices that had shaped his life. For the first time since burying his wife, he felt utterly and dangerously alone. The kind of aloneness that stripped a man down to the raw truth of himself. He had spent months pretending silence was strength, convincing himself that submission was sacrifice, that humility was grace. But now, lying in the shadows, he recognized those lies for what they were: excuses. Excuses to avoid facing the hard truth that his son had betrayed him and that he had allowed it to happen. The humiliation pressed against his ribs, but beneath it something else stirred, something old, something buried. Determination. He had been a builder his entire life. He knew how to look at a pile of rubble and see the framework of a new foundation. He knew how to hold a blueprint in his mind and bring it to life with his hands. And now, staring into the dark, he began to sketch a different kind of blueprint. Not for walls or cabinets or rooftops, but for justice, for reclamation, for revenge. The father turned onto his side, the springs of the cot groaning under his weight. He no longer cared about the noise. Let them hear it. Let them be reminded that he was still there, breathing in the shadows, waiting. They thought he had been pushed aside, that he had accepted exile without a fight. But silence was not surrender. Silence was preparation. He thought of his wife again, but now her face no longer haunted him with grief. It steadied him. She had trusted him with their son, trusted him to protect, to guide, to correct. He had failed her in that duty by mistaking indulgence for love, but failure was not permanent. Correction was still possible. And if Michael would not stand for his father, then his father would stand for himself. He would remind his son and everyone else inside that house exactly whose name had been etched into every stone, every board, every corner. His breath steadied, slow and deliberate. Each inhale drew strength from the past, from the years of labor and sacrifice that had built not only the home, but the man himself. Each exhale carried away the weight of humiliation, leaving only clarity. They had stripped his cabinets, painted over his wife's designs, filled the rooms with shallow laughter. But they had not stripped him of his will. They had not painted over his resolve. They had not silenced the builder who knew better than anyone how to dismantle and rebuild from the ground up. A storm had begun to gather inside him, quiet but relentless. The betrayal, the humiliation, the grief, they were no longer weights dragging him down. They were fuel. Every slight, every insult, every cold night on the cot only sharpened his focus. He would not lash out blindly. That was what they expected. No, he would move carefully with precision the way he once measured every beam before it was set in place. He would choose his moment, and when he did, they would not see it coming. He closed his eyes, listening to the laughter fade into murmurs as the night deepened. Soon the voices would quiet, the lights would dim, and the house would settle into its false sense of peace. But peace was an illusion, and the man in the garage was done pretending. He whispered to the silence not as a plea, but as a vow. This ends here. Stay with me, because the night he rose from that cot was the night the balance of power shifted forever. If you've ever been betrayed by family, subscribe and share your story. You'll want to hear what happens next. When trust is misplaced, even within family, it can become the sharpest wound of all. This story is not just about a father left to sleep in a cold garage. It's a warning about the dangers of giving too much without boundaries. Love and sacrifice are noble, but when they come at the cost of dignity, they turn into chains. Many older Americans know this feeling, spending a lifetime building only to feel invisible when the years of strength begin to fade. The lesson is clear. Protection doesn't mean surrender, and generosity doesn't mean erasing yourself. True love sometimes means saying no, setting limits, and reminding others where respect begins and ends. A legacy is more than property. It is the value of standing firm even when it hurts. For those who have ever felt discarded or overlooked, remember that silence isn't the same as weakness. Your worth doesn't fade because others fail to see it. Sometimes the greatest act of protection is reclaiming your voice. If this message speaks to you, subscribe now and share your own story, because someone out there needs to hear that they are not alone.